Where were you when the rains came this last week? Well, they came several times, which was very exciting. Twice, I was in meetings when they came, and that was wonderful to hear them. But the last time I was in my bed in the pre-dawn, pre-alarm bliss of sleep, and when I heard the music of the rain on the roof, I leapt up to go out and put out the vessels which would allow me to collect the rainwater. It was very exciting. I was so joyous it was raining, and I was even joyous when someone gave me the not-so-joyous fact that late rains will produce more grass, which will increase our fire danger. I was just happy for the rain in that moment. And then, a few hours later, for the giddy green shoots on the redwood, whose days we both know are numbered. But we celebrate, she and I, she with her green shoots and me with a sense of spiritual uplift, that grounding which Michael evoked in his meditation today, their meditation today. The rains fell on those also finishing up the disking and weed whacking on the MDUUC hill one of the other times this week as well. This is an annual activity to prevent fire, and it used to be that we had to have it done by Memorial Day, but the grasses were already dry by Easter this year. Earlier this spring, the last of what David Stanley told me were once 100 pine trees planted by this congregation were removed from our hills, victims of the beetles, which are believed to be so widespread and so deadly to the area's pine trees because of the warming of our climate. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. However, I suspect there are some people out there who this year tried not to think so much about Earth Day and climate change because it just feels too overwhelming to think about. We have so much going on in our personal lives. We have so many things that are happening all around us, and we're still pretty tired from these last years that we've been through of all kinds of things that have changed. And we can feel dispirited in the sense of being disconnected. You know, one thing that I've really loved about coming back together into this physical space, for those of us who have been able to do that, is the moment we just had a minute ago where people come up and drop the silent stone, and I get to stand there and see them and meet their eyes. And what's really interesting is when people first come back, they often look just at the basket. And over time, they start to look back at the person and the people around them, and you can see them re-engaging. It's the way that we are all now struggling to reconnect our spirits. And 2 years of a global pandemic is something that we're trying to consider how to do and how to come back together. And so it may have felt a little overwhelming to think about Earth Day this year, but we are going to do that here together because that is important to us as well. Laura Van Dermot Lipsky, who works with mission-driven people whose work to repair the world often becomes a kind of traumatic, vicarious experience, did offer the model that Michael gave us in their meditation. The goal is not to find more energy just to keep pushing through. The goal is to remember that we must have a balance in our energy. So many of us feel as if we have to be all in, and it was so wonderful to have our example of Bob Joe, who really is all in for climate change on behalf of our congregation, and we're really grateful for that. Or we have to just stay completely out, and that's not how it works. We can actually find a place in the middle, and it's important for us to think about this in this time when we are having so many other things that can keep us from wanting to have the energy to engage, including the atrocities of the war crimes in Ukraine, which assail us each day on our news. The relentless engagement or disengagement with these issues doesn't really work, though. Earth Day in an era of climate change isn't just about adaptive technologies and electric vehicles. It's about how we find our balance so that more of us can remain engaged, and that may be a good predictor of our future, how many of us can do that. I think we all know that the predictions are fairly dire right now. Bill McKibben, who actually has spoken from this sanctuary, and whose book, The End of Nature, brought the issue of climate change to the general public's attention 30 years ago, said in a recent address, "I try not to keep score, I try not to wake up in the morning and decide if I'm optimistic or pessimistic. It's enough to get up in the morning and figure out how much trouble you can cause. And then he continues, it's hard not to keep score, though, with climate change, because the numbers are always right there. Well, here's the good news. I'm actually not going to stand here this morning and give you a whole litany of these numbers, because we hear them, they're big, they're so scary that we don't even take them in sometimes. It's enough to turn our brains and commitments off when what we actually need to do right now is to turn them back on. So we're going to try something else, instead of just a long list of all the things that would frighten us. There's a method that is used with people who have had traumatic experience, and it's something called pendulation. It's when you go back and forth between what is reassuring and what is threatening, and that can actually diminish our fearful and overwhelming response to the threat. As one practitioner explained it, pendulation is a shifting of body sensations or emotions between those of expansion and those of contraction. And this ebb and flow allows the polarities to gradually be integrated. Expansion and contraction are moments of what I'm calling this morning downcast and uplift. So let's try this together. And I'm going to invite you to think about it if you want. Just in your lap, if you want, you can raise your hands up or down just slightly. You can open or close your fists as you take these in. But it's a way that we can actually take them into our presence and actually be present here physically for those of us who are, and for those of us watching at home, to be aware of where we are as well. So here's the thing of uplift. This year, for the 2022 Earth Day, it wasn't just a few countries, it was 170 countries that marked this day, this year. But the downcast is that it's still largely focused on pollution issues, where the more pressing issues of climate change still seem too big to tackle. Another downcast is the predictions that we will continue to experience the costs of climate change, including extreme weather, fires, floods, hurricanes. Last July was the hottest month ever in recorded history. But here's a moment of uplift. Are all the young leaders who are trying to call attention to the issues facing our planet. Bill McKibben says he now regularly meets with leaders who are 11 and 12 years old, who are leading their communities on real issues to get attention to these issues, including school strikes, talking to local officials, and undertaking specific projects. And I watched quite a lot of these folks and these voices this week, and I will tell you they are extremely, extremely motivating. Another uplift. A record amount of investment has been made in adaptive technologies, and solar is now more affordable than it has ever been. And for the first time in the history of the planet, it is a very viable thing that we could use these alternative technologies instead of the fossil fuels that we use so often. But the downcast is that Russia's war on Ukraine has set back our national agenda around fossil fuels, and this week, President Biden announced new drilling leases for the Arctic and other lands that have been placed back into protection. We know about melting seas and rising sea levels, and they're tied to fossil fuels. So that is another thing that we are holding. And another downcast is this is hard to say, fast fashion trend in the clothing industry, which intentionally emphasizes disposable clothing to be replaced again and again. And the fast fashion industry, I found this very interesting, is responsible for 10% of the world's use of fossil fuels. So if you're driving a hybrid but trading in your jeans every 2 months, you might want to rethink it, right? An uplift. So again, an uplift is the number of people who are starting to think about the choices they make, not only in how they spend their money, but how they invest their money and the companies that they invest in. Another uplift. It has been 30 years since the alarms began to sound about climate change. A downcast. It's been 30 years since the alarms began to sound about climate change. Many of the largest corporations knew about the effects even before these alarms were sounded. Pioneers leader Kenny Ausubel points out that there are just 100 companies, they're called carbon majors, and they account for 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Many of them knew full well the consequences, but the uplift is 100 companies at least helps us know where we need to focus our action, and more activists are focusing on those corporations. Perhaps what this pendulation is showing all of us is that while it is clear we are dangerously behind, the spiritual technologies to better engage now also exist. The awareness that some cannot be all in while everyone else sits by being kind of out. Our engagement with this world isn't just a theoretical concept of an interdependent web of existence. It's what we do every day, and it's what we believe. As Indigenous author Suzanne Mathot notes from her tradition, an individual's spirit surrounds and holds within it everything that exists in the natural world: the soil, the trees, the plants, the air, the wind, the minerals, and animals. Even things that are made by human innovation become part of the world around us, and thus part of our spirit. You know, another important resource in these times that is a spiritual resource is humor. So about now, you might need a joke. Upjoke.com offers this joke about predictive text. And if you don't know what predictive text is, it's the technology that facilitates typing on a mobile device that will fill in your sentences for you. Yes. Anyone who's ever texted with me knows a lot about that. But here's the joke. The inventor of predictive text was injured in a traffic accident. He's been baconed by Ambience to the horse piddle. So here's the thing. There are things that perhaps might be predictive text about what's going to happen to our planet, but it doesn't take into account our ability to pay attention and correct our course. And any feelings about guilt that we aren't doing enough are not a spiritual resource. Let me say that again. Any feelings about guilt that we're not doing enough are not a spiritual resource. Laura Van Dernet Lipsky writes, personal feelings of guilt are impossible to separate from larger forces, like socio-political context, life experiences, and spiritual beliefs. When we try to get a handle on guilt, we have to grapple with questions like, how do we live in a world where there's such a disparity of resources? What can we do to neutralize imbalances? And how do we participate in our own privileges in a responsible manner? How can I cope with this, enjoy my life, and not be immobilized by guilt? If any of these questions intrigue you, you can join me for a book discussion of her work, which is starting soon here during the week. This is the thing about climate change. We really can't predict what will happen. As Bill McKibben said, we've learned a lot about what happens in this world when money and greed keep us from moving as we need to move. He says, I've given you the setup, and I'm not going to tell you the outcome of all this fight. The reason I'm not going to tell you is I don't know. And this is a man who has devoted the last 3.5 decades of his life to this struggle. He says, this is different from other fights humans have been in before because it's a time test. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King used to end speeches by saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, McKibben says, the arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends towards heat. So as individuals, we will use our powers of choice and voice to do what we can. We can write institutions to which we are connected to find out where they invest their dollars or their endowments. More than $11 billion worth of university and college endowments have now been tried by the climate test, and that is making such a difference that it's entering into the corporate reports of companies like Shell. We fear that if we re-engage, we will be overwhelmed. We fear that we will not be able to overcome if we leave our safe place of disengagement. But if you are here today and you knew what the topic was before you came, thank you. And if you're watching it later because people said it wasn't really as depressing as it might have been, thanks also. I've been told by people that as we reemerge from this pandemic, we should only talk about positive things on Sunday mornings. But here's the deal. Actually, folks, from a spiritual sense, if we do that, it will only increase our anxiety, and it will deny us the liberating power of knowing our own strengths. So let's approach this all together, because we are not the ones who want to sit around feeling powerless when we know that there are things we could do that might make a difference. Together we can hold the uplift and the downcast of this forever turning earth and right-size our place in it. We need be neither the savior nor the absentee. We can expand and contract and keep honoring our deep relationship with all of life.